What's the point of giving arguments for your beliefs when no one is ever actually convinced by arguments? This is a sentiment I hear all the time. But is arguing really the problem? When I use the word argument, I'm simply referring to a reason to accept some proposition or claim. And so I'm not necessarily talking about those heated disagreements that we typically think of when we hear the word argument. The idea that argumentation is useless is something that you may have encountered before. Like maybe you and a friend were arguing about something and at some point they say, "Man, what is even the point of arguing about this? I mean, it's not like one of us will ever change our mind about this." For me personally, I mostly hear this from my other Christian friends when they tell me about their failed attempts at evangelizing like a family member or friend or something like that, where not only was the argumentation unsuccessful, but it actually had an additional negative consequence. So maybe it accidentally damaged a relationship, or it pushed a family member further away, or something to that effect. This was the sort of scenario I had in mind when writing the script for this video. However, the things I say here will be general enough that it would apply to anyone of any kind of beliefs or lack thereof. When it comes to the claim that arguments are totally useless, my take is that it's not necessarily the fact that you're giving an argument that's the problem, but rather how and when. And so, originally what I thought about doing was, I'll just talk about people that changed their whole worldview and how arguments had a big role to play in that, like say, C.S. Lewis or Edward Fazer. But then it's like, if I'm just here listing people, how am I supposed to make that funny? So instead, I thought, I'll just give unsolicited advice on how to have more productive arguments, because who doesn't like unsolicited advice? This is the part of the video where one would generally give a disclaimer and say like, "This is just my opinion and I'm not claiming to be an expert," and oh, why was I bringing this up? Well, I feel like there was some important reason I was leading up to. Well, it must not have been that important. Well, anyway, here are some things to consider before making your next argument. Number 1, diagnose. That is, figure out what this person needs before jumping straight into argument mode. So take, for example, if someone is coming to you and they have some grievance with whatever, their Christian family, and they're saying, "Oh, this is so ridiculous, how can anyone believe this, yada yada." Before immediately jumping into, "Oh, well, here's why you're wrong," maybe it would be better to just first listen to what they have to say and figure out what this person actually needs at this time. Maybe they just need someone to vent to. Maybe their hang-up isn't even so much this intellectual thing, even if that is, say, a component, but there might be something else deeper going on that should really be addressed first, lest you come across like some cold, callous kind of person, right? I think oftentimes, instead of a good argument, what someone really needs is a good person, and you might be the next best thing. Cool. Glad that happened. Number 2, have reasonable expectations. It's easy to think that if the person we're trying to convince doesn't change their mind right in front of us, right then and there, then the argument must have been unsuccessful. I mean, after all, the whole point of an argument is to change someone's mind, and so if they don't change their mind, then doesn't that mean the argument was unsuccessful? Except for the fact that people aren't computers, and you can't just plug in the right syllogism and expect a predicted outcome. And as much as a lot of people like to brag about how if only they were presented with the right argument or good enough evidence, then of course they would change their mind right there on the spot, that's typically not something anyone's pride or ego actually allows for. So then what should we hope for when presenting an argument? For me personally, whenever I hear someone say something like, "Oh, I've never thought of that before," or "Hey, maybe I'll have to look into it," as far as I'm concerned, I just stop pushing my argument right then and there, and I just leave it at that. And so for me, that's kind of my criteria, is when they stop arguing back against me and then say something along those lines. Especially when you're arguing over something that's like a pretty big deal, like an entire worldview, that's the kind of thing that can take years or even decades to change. There was this analogy I heard from the philosopher Randall Rouser. It was something to the effect of, if you're trying to get a vacuum out of a closet and you open the door, if the vacuum is right there within arm's reach, then it's pretty easy to just take the vacuum out of the closet. And this would be representative of a trivial belief. But when you're talking about like a whole worldview, that would be like if you open the closet to get the vacuum, but the vacuum is behind 100 boxes. And it's like, okay, well, I'm going to need to move 100 boxes before I can even get to the vacuum cleaner. And so that's more like arguing against someone's entire worldview, where you're not just talking about one trivial little thing. In many cases, for someone to change their worldview, they're going to have to change their whole way of living. And the final thing I want to say on that point is, even if to you it doesn't seem like you're really getting through to anyone or even moving the needle at all, you never really know what's going on in someone's mind. And so maybe you are getting through to them, but just don't know it. And that's it on that one. Okay, moving on. Number 3, seek to understand before being understood. And a good way to do this practically is by repeating to your interlocutor their argument back to them, but in your own words. So the person you're talking to gives an argument, and you listen to the argument, and then you say their argument back to them, but in your own words. And this is a good opening move for a few reasons. For one, it shows that you were actually listening, and possibly even sincerely care about what they're saying, and that's not something that people often experience. So take, for example, a situation that I'm sure we've all been in. Your ex-girlfriend's stepdad says, "Well, answer me this. Why would anyone in their right mind believe in a man on a cloud in the sky?" Repeating their argument back to them, or in this case their like weird slogan-y question sort of thing, it gives your brain a second to switch gears, and so you can kind of prepare yourself to engage that question. And when you're repeating his question back to him in your own words, you can use that opportunity to clarify any ambiguity. So you might say something like, "Okay, you're asking me why I believe in a man on a cloud in the sky, but I can't say I'm familiar with any kind of doctrine that claims that. Now, maybe you're talking about our belief in God, but if that's the case, then I think that our conceptions of God are very different, because at least in my tradition, we don't believe in anything like what you just described." Oops, it's the next day, hence I am wearing different clothes and the lighting is a little bit different. What are you going to do about it? Anyway, repeating your interlocutor's argument back to them in your own words is a really good opening move, especially compared to what I think a lot of us really want to do, especially if you're the kind of person that's really into the philosophy, debating type stuff. I think the temptation can be, I am going to just jump right into the most long-winded argument that no one wanted to hear, but it's like extended edition with director's commentary and behind the scenes. If you are not this person, you've at least met this person at least once. So let's say you have these two dudes arguing, and the first dude is like, "Oh, you believe in a man on a cloud or whatever." And the second dude is like, "Well, you know what I have to say to that. Premise 1, there's a sufficient reason for the being of whatever is and for all attributes of any being. Premise 2, the world exists. Premise 3, Slow down there, cowboy. You're probably not going to get very far by dropping the fattest exposition dump since the graveyard scene in Dune Part 1. It's also super annoying and no one will like you. But enough of that. Part 4, or Step 4? What am I calling these? I don't know. Stick to the topic. When it rains, it pours, and when someone has beef with your worldview, it's typically not for just one reason, but a myriad of things that you're gonna hear all about whether you want to or not. When you encounter someone like that, if you've determined that they're the sort of person that would be good to have a rational discourse with, as opposed to say the kind of thing we talked about in part 1, then something that I've actually found pretty useful is asking them which of those points they find the most compelling, and then beginning with that. So if they're just railing against your worldview and they're listing A, B, and C, you can say, okay, so you mentioned this, and this, and this, and this, and so forth. Out of all of these, which of these really just grinds your gears the most? And then maybe we can start there. And then from there, you can essentially hold them accountable to sticking to that topic. And again, this is going to depend a lot on like the personality of, you and the person you're talking to. But this just makes it way easier to work through things systematically, as opposed to trying to just chase down 100 different things at once. So going back then to that situation I brought up before, the one that we've all been in, that is super relatable, that every single one of us has encountered. Say it with me. Your ex-girlfriend, stepdad is belittling your belief in God and making these snide comments. Of course. So let's say you're talking to this dude, and he's making that comment, and you're giving your response, and it's that part of the conversation where you're presenting this argument. So you're giving an argument for the existence of God. And when they respond to your argument, instead of actually engaging like any of the premises or the logic of it or anything like that, they just say, oh, but what about Bible contradictions? How do you explain that? It's like, okay, well, that doesn't really have anything to do with my argument, does it? Because defending the existence of God is different from defending the Bible, because you can believe in God and still not be a Christian. In fact, many people do. So, oh, and if that comment confuses you about how you can defend the existence of God in a way that really doesn't have anything to do with Christianity, I did like a 3-part whole ding-dang video on it. So you can check that out if you want to like waste 40 minutes of your life. Number 5, understand that not everyone can be reasoned with. Of course, objectively, it's part of our human nature to be able to reason, but I'm sure you've encountered those personalities that just refuse to engage your argument or your perspective in any meaningful way. So maybe it's someone that's just trying to get a reaction out of you, or they're just trying to get under your skin, or something like that. Who knows? Or better yet, who cares? Because if someone is not willing to engage your position in any meaningful way, then maybe it's just time to kick the dust off of your feet and move on. Because if they're not willing to do that, it's not your responsibility. It's not your job to go around convincing everyone of your perspective. And I know that especially within a Christian context, you can feel that pressure of like, oh, I have to be the one, because like if I'm not gonna do this, then like who knows? It's like, that's just not how that works. If someone is not even willing to hear you out in like a meaningful way where they're not being antagonistic or immature or anything like that, it's really not your problem. Okay, well that's that. In the next video, I talk about how to defend your beliefs without being defensive about it, when I talk about your secret weapon, the undercutting defeater. Okay, the end. Cool.